Good evening, everybody. Welcome to A World Awakening tonight. As you can see, neither of us are Andrea Perrin. Unfortunately, for all of us, Andrea has some business to attend to tonight, some family matters, and has just had a rather busy week. So she contacted me last evening and asked if I could just kind of take the wheel tonight for both shows. Soul School Sojourn, which, if you do not regularly watch Soul School Sojourn, airs 1 hour prior to A World Awakening. I think probably most A World Awakening viewers do tune in for Soul School as well, but you never know. So for future reference, Andrea and I both host a show together just prior to this show. And so we just finished that one. Aaron Tomlinson and I, who has been a guest on Soul School several times, who's become a really good friend over the last several months. Aaron is a former evangelical charismatic pastor turned something else. we both don't know. Neither of us know what the hell we are anymore.
Exactly.
A spiritual teacher, a licensed therapist. Do you still pastor? Do you still have a physical church where you meet?
No, we don't.
No, not anymore. Okay. You did prior to COVID or at the
Right.
beginning, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But pastored for many years, and he's been a guest on Soul School many times. We always have amazing conversations. We just finished one of those amazing conversations. I won't say we finished it because we're going to continue it for the next 50 some odd minutes. But we are also really, really honored tonight, and I want to just get out of the way really quickly so we can bring her in here and give her as much time to talk as well. We're really honored tonight to welcome Heather Hamilton, who is a best-selling author of a brand new book called Returning to Eden. She's an author with Choir Publishing, whom I am also associated with proudly. And I really think that she's going to have some very interesting things to add to the conversation that Aaron and I were already having. And the show, it's very free flowing. It's very stream of consciousness. We just kind of go wherever the wind blows us. And it usually blows us. It usually takes us somewhere pretty amazing. So we're going to let that be tonight. So Heather, if you want to bring Heather on, welcome to the show tonight, Heather. We're really pleased to have you.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Aaron. Hey, Jeff, and everybody listening. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. And I also want to publicly praise you for your sainthood for coming on so last minute. Like it was literally this morning I sent you a Facebook message because you just came to mind, and I had already reached out to Aaron, and I was like, holy crap, we have a whole nother hour. We should bring Heather on too. And it would just blend perfectly with the conversation that I know we're going to have. And so thank you so much for being willing to come on and alter your schedule in any way it needed to be altered. We're really honored that you're here with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Honestly, these like last minute spur of the moment things are always my favorite because it's like, yes, let's just see what happens.
Yeah, so, yeah, for sure. So Heather, why don't you go ahead and just, I could give you an introduction, but you probably know yourself better than I know you. I'm sure you know yourself better than I know you. But if you want to just maybe give us a very brief introduction as to who you are, what it is you do and you're aiming to do. Tell us maybe just a little bit about your book, just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to hop into a conversation that we were having, and I'm going to obviously make the details of that privy to you, and we'll just see where we go. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, as you already mentioned, I'm an author of this book. I've got it all marked up with my sticky notes, but it's called Returning to Eden. Yeah, the big picture, I live in Georgia with my husband and 3 kids. I've got 3 wonderful kids, and like the both of you, came from an evangelical background. And about 5 years ago, I didn't have language for this at the time, but I had what I would define now as a mystical experience that really just opened up the world for me and also completely shattered my world. I know that you both can probably resonate with that. And I didn't know that I would be writing a book about that experience, but it just plunged me into a really intense deconstruction process, and ferociously reading for years, trying to absorb as much information I could that would give me language for the new way that I was seeing reality. And along that journey, and I get into it in the book was a lot of the literalism that I had, been raised with, and I still held on to. That was very quickly falling away. But I found that in sacred texts and in the Bible were all these mythological stories and metaphors and symbolisms that were such precise pictures of my journey and my experience, and I really found them to be a very useful language that I already had embedded in me. But of course, it was very difficult to articulate in the evangelical context, but then also with others who had deconstructed or left organized religion or became atheist or spiritual but not religious or whatever. I didn't find a lot of people who really grasped the value of myth and metaphor and symbolism. And yeah, so I wrote a book about it, about how, for a lot of the Western world, we have this language embedded in us
Right.
that can be recovered to help us along our spiritual path and to, gain insight into our own psychology and our inner world. So that's what my book, Returning to Eden, is about.
Yeah. And I will tell everyone listening and watching that it's a fantastic book. I've listened to it. I didn't have the chance to sit down and read it, but I did listen to the audio version of it. And not only is it a wonderful narration by yourself, the book itself is just phenomenal. The material it's dense, very well written, and you're a very powerful author, and I just so appreciate what you've created in this book. And so Aaron and I were having a conversation prior to this hour on the last show about kind of our own deconstructive experiences in some way. And I was a pastor for 12 years. I grew up a fundamentalist, evangelical, charismatic. Aaron, similar, right?
Yeah.
And a pastor for many years as well. And we were discussing the fact that both of us, in different ways, mine was more of these fundamental axioms kind of tumbled down in my life. The foundations of reality for me, the rug of reality was pulled out from underneath me. My God concept died. And my theological sweater, the poorly knit as it was unwoven, and I found myself with nary a stitch of clothing left on. And I was like, what the hell do I do now? And it was traumatic. It was intense. I had no idea what to do in the aftermath of it. I was a pastor still while it happened, so that added another layer of difficulty to the whole thing. But I had to rediscover something like faith, right? And one of the things that Aaron and I had talked about was that we had both had supernatural, numinous, mystical experiences at different points in our life prior to the deconstruction experience. And I think, Aaron, your deconstruction was in a lot of ways more brought on in some way by the mystical experiences, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Whereas mine, I had the mystical experiences, and then I began to theologically understand the faultiness of the God concept that I held to. And then I actually tried to jettison my mystical experiences because I felt that they confirmed the God concept that I held to. So of course I've got to get rid of these. And so then I reasoned my way out of them. But then I eventually came to a point where I realized that I had been touched by something that I could not be untouched by, and it had left the mark on me, right? And this goes all the way back to my youth, to paranormal experiences that I had no explanation for, no expectation of ever happening. They just happened, up until my youth, where the experiences became more spiritual in the Christian sense in nature. And these were things I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried, and I tried very damn hard. But I couldn't get rid of them. And so I was forced to rediscover, in some ways, the faith that I was equally forced to leave behind. And I love what you said, that there was a language that was embedded in me that I couldn't get rid of. And Aaron, in the last show, you had said that for a season after your deconstruction, you really had to kind of disassociate yourself from all things Christian, just simply to be able to properly go through that healing process. And I went through a very similar experience. But then I found myself, as your book title speaks to, returning to Eden. I had left the garden, and Paul Ricoeur kind of describes that experience of being raised in the walled garden of Eden, where all things are perfect and then you partake of a form of knowledge that drives you from the garden of naivete, and you look over your shoulder and you find the entrance to that garden guarded by angels with flaming swords, symbolically speaking. You can never go back in. Once you partake of that knowledge, you can't go back.
True.
It's over. The mind once stretched, I think
true.
Oliver Wendell Holmes said, cannot ever return to its former dimensions. And so you can either stand at a critical distance and judge those who are still in there, or you can sit back and dream about the good old days, or you can just simply begin to journey, right? And the journey is always circular, right? The only way forward is to move in circles. So you begin to journey, but the journey is circular. So you move through the world and you think you're alone, right? Because you don't think there is anything anymore. But eventually, at some point in the journey, you begin to sense this divine presence with you. And then you begin to sense and discover that divine presence in the world when you thought that divine presence could only be found in the garden you left. Eventually, you come full circle. You come to the back door of Eden and you enter it into it again. And you enter in from an angle you never entered into before. And the whole thing looks different. And you realize now that not only can the divine be found here, but it can also be found out there, and I can come and go as I please, and the whole world is enchanted by the beauty of the divine, whatever name one gives it, right? And so that's kind of the experience that I had. And, you know, through the work of individuals like Joseph Campbell, through Jung, through others, I discovered so many of the principles that you lay out in your book. That is the symbolic, mythological approach to Scripture. It's my native tongue. It's one I can't shake or get rid of. And so I still use it, even though I use it in a very different way than I would have once used it. I still use it because it's the most powerful language to me, because it is my native language. And anyways, Heather, that's just a little brief intro. And I really want to give you the floor to kind of talk about your book, and feel free to comment on what I said and how it relates to what you've written, or feel free to just take it in a completely different direction. And Aaron, whenever you have a thought or you want to interject something as well, please do. Okay. So anyway, just, I don't know. I'm a preacher, so I can't help it. But we only have an hour, so I want to give you as much time as you need to just kind of share your ideas and how it might relate to what I said or how it might not.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said, because I think at the very beginning, we were kind of differentiating our stories a little bit, you know, like, oh, we kind of all ended up in this place, but you maybe got there different ways. But then as you're speaking symbolically, I'm like, yeah, it's the same story, you know?
It's the monomyth, right?
Yes, the monomyth, as Joseph Campbell talks about, you know, the hero's journey, where, you know, for people who aren't familiar with that, it'll be hard to, you know, articulate it without a visual. But, you know, if you picture a circle and there's a line through the middle of the circle, and so the top half of the circle would be the ordinary world, and then, you know, the bottom half of the circle is the underworld, or crossing the threshold, or the magical world, or whatnot. And like you said, Jeff, you know, when you're in the garden and everything is perfect, and you even made a joke about, you know, pulling the thread of your theology that was, I don't remember what you said, like, I don't know, tightly woven but not well, or something like that. But I'm like, it actually is, like, the amount of like mental stitching that you have to do. Like, it was so intricate, you know, how I made it all fit together, this worldview, where it did make complete sense to me at that time. And anything that was outside of it legitimately didn't make any sense to me. So it was just, I don't know, it was like packaged so intricately and woven together. But anyway, and when you're in the garden, you have no clue that there's anything else to the circle, you know? It's just, here we are. Why wouldn't everybody want to be here? This is a perfect little construct that we have for ourselves, a worldview that makes complete sense. And then, the same thing for me. I had a mystical experience, which was actually, it was really preceded by some illuminations that I had about my own life, really my own psychology, like a sudden zoom out as to, you know, why I had made certain decisions in my life, why I viewed the world that I did. And I realized that it was that everything about my brain was just pre-programmed. You know, I had 100% identified with the thoughts in my head, my feelings, and I thought that I was having this very unique experience, you know, throughout life or whatever. And then I kind of got a 30,000 foot view on myself and realized, oh, almost everything about me is robotic. Very, very little has been me, I suppose. And in zooming out and seeing that, it spurred an identity crisis, which was traumatic. I was about 32 years old, you know. So that was, an identity crisis and a certainty that I had already screwed up my three kids because I had been so asleep, and there was no going back and redeeming any of this or whatever. And I was just, a defiled piece of shit, basically. That's all you can see at that point.
Yeah.
But in zooming out and seeing it, there was also a recognition of who I really was. There was this little seed or a little light in me, where when I saw it, divine spark. I like that term. When I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and I started to view my whole life, and recognize that it had been there the whole time, even though I had been asleep to it. So in the story, something that I came across later on after this was, in the story of the garden, the God character puts Adam to sleep, and it never says that he wakes up. And that was just such a perfect picture of the pattern of life. And so I sort of recognized that this is what had happened to me, but that this is also the pattern for everybody else. So anyway, this everything that I'm explaining basically happened in like a matter of days, and I descended into this really dark psychological pit where I was, crying out to God, my God concept. And like you mentioned, Jeff, there was a moment of it completely evaporating. Like it was like whoever I thought was on the other side of this telephone line is not here. Like there's just no one on the end of the line. And I recognized that place as hell. I understood sort of in that moment that, whatever I had thought hell was, it was actually this like psychological rock bottom, this death of God moment, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's just everything had evaporated. And so I recognized that that's what hell was. But another surprising piece of the puzzle that came together in that moment was I knew that that is what the Jonah and the whale story was about. It's like, oh, this is where Jonah was. I knew in that moment that it wasn't a literal story. And it was so funny because, I prior to that, faith had just been this white knuckled grip on these implausible stories, that I really didn't think about too much. But suddenly it was like, oh, I know this is the belly of the whale, this dark place where you're just sucked into utter darkness. There's no exit out of it. You're essentially like sucked back into the womb, So I went back and like reread the story for the first time in like years. And sure enough, out of the belly of hell I cried. There he was, So I understood these stories to be naming these patterns and the idea of spiritual rebirth. We talk about that so much in church, and same as both of you, I think. My husband was the music director at this large mega church at the time. Like all of our income was tied to this, and this is quickly unraveling. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is bad news, So anyway, but yeah, I understood spiritual rebirth, this whole concept of going back into the womb. It was like, oh yeah, I got swallowed back into the womb. And so anyway, it was at that point where, in my story, that recognition of hell was so psychologically intense for me that we had to call 911 because it was just like my nervous system could not contain what was happening. And so we did, and some EMS workers arrived, and we opened the door, and immediately I recognized one of the women to be a transgender woman. And at the time, that was very unexpected for me. We live in the South, a very evangelical context, and I would have never. I considered myself a very tolerant person. We even, were involved in a ministry where it was like the outreach was like, everybody come, come as you are kind of thing. So I had, lots of interaction and friends who were a part of the LGBTQ community, but there was still this orientation of like, I'm the one that has the truth. I'm supposed to be bestowing the truth on you and helping you. And it wasn't, there wasn't like an even playing field. But as this woman started talking to me, it was like the spirit of what I would call Christ, whatever word you have for that, like this divine spirit, started coming off of her, and I recognized it immediately. And that was really like the crux of my mystical experience was this conversation, essentially like Jesus in this transgender body showing up on my front porch, and I'm like the evangelical megachurch girl who's supposed to be saving all these people, so it was just a total role reversal, good Samaritan type situation. And so yeah, as you were describing, Jeff, it was like I saw the divine spark in this woman, which I my language for that was Christ, and I saw it in me, and then pretty immediately I saw it in everybody else, and then soon after that it was like I see it in all creation, and I sort of recognized like the God concept that died obviously died because it wasn't real, but it gave birth to this new concept of like being in the womb of God, It was like a being a child in utero looking for its mother and like being terrified that it couldn't find its mother when all the while you're like inside of her. There was nowhere to go. It's like I'm a part of God, I'm an extension of whatever this is. So it's inside of me and it's outside of me. And yeah, so this was like very good news personally, and then on the other hand, it was like, oh no, how do I undo everything that I'm doing, and so there was sort of this period of like trying to not tear down, but just I don't go back and correct everything that I was a part of, and then eventually realizing, oh, it doesn't really people don't respond well when you just blurt out things like, "I don't believe in hell anymore," or,
Right.
I thought it would be good news, but apparently it wasn't good news, and so,
I
suddenly
have no idea what that's like.
Yeah, but I very soon started to see the whole thing as the process of human growth and development, where 5 minutes ago, I had been in the quote unquote, one type of garden, and now I was cast out of it. And I knew I had recognized that, which that's something that's always been a little confusing to me, in terms of, speaking to other people who've deconstructed or whatever, and seem to get so angry at, people who are still very much rooted in that belief system that I had. I'm like, there's nothing logical or rational about it, I literally had to go to hell to like get out of it. And I completely understand why nobody would want to go there. It's something that just happens to you. So yeah, so pretty quickly my approach became, let's not argue or attack or whatever. Like, how can I try to bring some of these new insights and illuminations, how can I bring them forth artfully in a beautiful way, something that's inspiring, something that makes more sense as opposed to like, trying to tell someone why they're wrong, because it's just not going to go over well. So yeah, like you said, it was more about how do we get minds to expand, whereas like when we're attacking, quite literally, like minds are just contracting into a defensive posture.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah. Aaron, do you have any comments on anything that was said?
I'm entranced with your story, Heather, because I see so many parallels with my own. And I think it's interesting that your livelihood came from ministry as well. And I've always said people who go through this process, whatever we want to call it, those that were the most devoted oftentimes suffer the worst, because we fully invested our lives into these things. And for me, I went through a real existential crisis. Like, who am I now? You know, obviously being a pastor, my career was tied to that. Jeff, you can relate to that as well. Like, how are we going to provide for our families? Where am I going? You know, it's kind of that lost place. And so when you're talking about hell being in the soul, or you're talking about being in the belly of the whale like Jonah, it really is that sort of that existential issue, right? That, at least for me, and I guess I'm wondering, was that part of this experience for you when you say, you know, I was in hell and I was in this dark place? Was it existential for you, or what were the components of that made it so tormenting for you?
Yeah, it was an existential crisis. In that moment, I had never had any kind of suicidal ideation or anything like that. This, quite honestly, it plunged my nervous system into a such foreign territory for me, where, you know, I had just had my third child, so I'm still like nursing a baby, and I could not, I could barely get through like a session of nursing without having a panic attack. Like it was almost just back to back to back to back. Maybe like a metaphor I could give for it was just like feeling like I was in this psychological, emotional electric chair that was just turned on. Like I felt like I was getting electrocuted. And there was nothing that was like, oh, I want to die. It was, I cannot live like this, period. And so, all my coping mechanisms were exhausted. And at the time, I had already had about 15 years of therapy under my belt, like talk therapy. And so in my mind, I was going, that's not going to help me. You know, I've this isn't a talking thing. This is, I can hardly get 2 hours of sleep without waking up with PTSD and panicking, you know? So, just at that moment, it was almost like, I'm either going to commit suicide or get addicted to Xanax. Like that feels, and that was the first time that I had ever, understood substance abuse or anything, but this was literally like over the course of like 4 days, I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I understand addiction. I understand, the severity of like some of these struggles. So it was, yes, to your point, it was, we finally called 911 because I was like, I think that my life is in danger, of myself. And, I had resisted that because I thought, if I call, I'm going to end up in a mental hospital, and I just had a baby. And that felt like the worst case scenario for me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, but it was that extreme that I was like, okay, let's just, fate, whatever, I'm like at the end of the rope. So anyway, and during that conversation with the transgender woman, it was actually, it was part of just what made it, aside from like the way that she was speaking to me, like in the aroma of love that was coming off of her, was kind of just the series of events that happened right then. It was, don't come to the hospital with us. Like, you need to go see your counselor. So it was my husband calling the counselor, we're always all booked up. This never happens, but someone just canceled. Can you be here in an hour, kind of thing?
Wow.
Yes, we can be here in an hour. You know what I mean? And then walking into my counselor's office, and, since the time I had last seen her, she'd become certified in this therapy called EMDR. And it was stop talking, don't talk anymore, hold on to these little paddles, and, we're going to reprocess your memories. And it was just like, boom, I was at rock bottom at the end of the rope. And for the first time was just like, whatever I need to do to get out of this situation or get better, I'm going to do it. So, it was from there about 6 months of really intense like EMDR therapy, where I was like, in the book, I talk about my psychology being like pipes and my spirit being the water, like running through those pipes. And so the pipes were so messed up that, if you can think about like water running in your house, if there's a busted up pipe or a bent pipe and there's just water, like, trying to get through, first it's going to start dripping, you're going to be like, oh, I have a leak. And if you don't fix it, pretty soon the pipe is just going to bust. So that's essentially what happened. But as like I worked out the pipes, as that was getting better, it was like I could feel my life energy in my body in a way that I had never felt before. Like I would wake up in the middle of the night and just feel like tingling sensations like all over my body, but not like in an itchy way. It was like a very pleasant feeling where I would kind of just lay there at night and like feel it. So I recognized all of this as like, an awareness of my own spirit, and kind of the divine all around me. And I felt at home, like for the first time. But all that to say, aside from all of what I was experiencing personally, which was very healthy, there was kind of a higher level existential crisis going on where, like the God concept had died, which on one hand was a relief, but on the other hand was like this grieving process of, I don't really know anything anymore. I'm having some anxiety about, I don't know. On one hand, it was like I'd kind of faced my fear of death, where it's like, okay, that moment in quote unquote hell was like, this is as bad as it's going to get. So pretty much nothing in life is going to be that terrifying. So it kind of freed me up to like, take more risks and as Joseph Campbell would say, like follow my bliss and live my life.
Right.
But that there was still, it's like, Jeff, you can probably resonate with this. I felt like I was like a part-time atheist, it was like all the, maybe there was a tiny, like a small point in time where I did not, I don't want to fully embrace it, but it was just like, I don't know anything. And it was a very like depressing, nihilistic stage, which I ended up reading this book called The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich, where he basically affirmed this, which I loved. He was a Lutheran pastor, but affirmed like that an honest, pure faith journey will eventually lead you to this place of atheism, where everything is kind of gone and you have a rational explanation for all of it. And then all that's left to do at that point is to put yourself on the map. Like the only factor that I'm not considering here is how I feel. What do I love? What do I find beautiful? Like what do I think could maybe be possible? And then I just, that was like the true beginning of faith for me was I don't have any certainty that what I'm saying is 100% right, but I think it's right. I think if I make my way up to the edge of the Red Sea and refuse to turn around and just keep walking, I think something will open up. So that was even the case with the book. Like this whole book, I was like, this is complete heresy for, for my family, my community, whatever. I was like terrified to put it out, but I had these 3 kids. I was like, if I'm never not here, I need my kids to have this book. So I'm first and foremost, writing it for them. But I wrote the whole thing before I had a publisher. So it was like, I don't even know if I'm going to put this out. Maybe it'll sit on my computer. But I wrote it all, and just every kind of step has been like that. And it was like, I'm doing it because I want this to exist in the world,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Aaron.
No,
No, go ahead.
I love what you're talking about here, because I just love how you said almost discovering yourself. Like, what do I find beautiful? What I remember having a similar type experience going through the grocery store. What kind of food do I really like? Like expanding out. That's how rigid we get, right, in our patterns, and how stuck we get. And so as my mind was expanding in all these ways that you really described, I was also exploring myself by allowing myself to try different things that I hadn't tried before, and really finding out what's me. And especially for people who have been through trauma, and once you go through that experience with a trauma-informed therapist that can help you heal those areas of your life, then you begin to realize also so much of what I was doing was a trauma response.
Yeah.
And I was able to go back to ministry and look at so much of what I did, I was doing as a trauma response. There were times, you might appreciate this part of my story, when I kind of like woke up in like 20 minutes because I had this really visionary, mystical experience. But the first thing in the experience that I heard was, if you disown your shadow, you will confuse the voice of your shadow for the voice of God. And this God concept that we see in the Bible is very much, in many ways, a projection of our shadow self, right?
Yeah.
Sort of egotistical megalomaniac that wants meticulous control over every aspect of your life, and doesn't come through for you in times of trial always, but wants you to worship it anyway. And so I was able to see how I was masking my pain, and I was masking my trauma with some of the things that I was doing in ministry, thinking it was God.
Yeah.
What's your response to that, as far as like with the shadow or projection? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh, totally. I wrote about that as well, about how kind of reconciling who we see in Jesus or in Christ as a reflection of what God is really like, versus the kind of schizophrenic God that we see in the Old Testament, where it's like, sometimes we get love, sometimes we get violence, and yes. So I call it like the evolution of human consciousness. It's our concepts of God. I think Meister Eckhart said, I pray God to rid me of God. And it's this constant shedding of illusions, where our human consciousness slowly evolves into finally this picture, which for me includes the shadow. It includes the whole of it. And so, going back to that metaphor that I was giving about the pipes and the spirit, something that Joseph Campbell points out is, what we would call a demon or a devil is really this repressed life energy hidden in the shadow, where when it wants to come up, it wants to have expression in our life, but we've disowned it, and so we push it down, or it's blocked, and we just continue to make the block more severe. And so the energy builds up until there's this explosion, and we really are like in the grip of something beyond our control, which, in the Christian religion, because we've discarded the shadow and pushed and repressed it, we call it a demon, we call it Satan or whatever. And the more we repress it, the more powerful it becomes. So yeah, it was a huge revelation for me to look at some of those unhealthy coping mechanisms that at one time I would have said, this is an attack from Satan, this is something from the outside or whatever, and realize, oh my gosh, this is actually what's going to save me, is when I turn around and face it, go into the dark and recover what is buried down there, and work to like integrate it into my life. And so, yeah, it's this acceptance of the whole, including, I kind of deconstruct the concept of good and evil, but there are, like the law of three. So you have like a positive and a negative force that are coming together in order to create something new. So you have to have those two forces for there to even be like incarnation, So those two forces they're both legitimate, but in our rational minds, we suppress one of them, and then it becomes more and more violent. So it's more about, how do I integrate this? What do I do with it? For me, a way that I've learned to practice that. I mean, depression has been something that I've, dealt with at various different times in my life. But, of course, that was always something where it was like, this is of the devil, you got to fight it, blah, blah, blah. And now I understand, like, oh, sometimes this is a creative depression, something where there's something inside of me deep down that wants to be born, and I have to go down and get it. And recover it and bring it up. And so as uncomfortable it is, it's like even just visualizing, this black hole next to me where everything in me, it just wants to like lean away from it. But even just visualizing me turning towards it and going into it, that's how I kind of integrate my quote unquote dark energy or whatever. I find the most creative inspiration to be down there.
Yeah. And, in talking about the shadow, and Aaron, you and I have talked about the shadow on the show. Andrea and I have talked about the shadow for several shows in the past few weeks. I'll just go ahead and say this, because atheism has come up several times tonight. I think that modern atheism, or the quote unquote new atheist movement, really is the shadow side of Christianity that's come uncoupled from it, because we did not integrate it, right? We don't embrace the whole idea of the coincidentio oppositorum, the coincidence of seeming opposites. And so, that atheism is a friend. It's a prophetic ally, right? Yep. It's actually a part of the whole, right? Jesus, who is Jesus the Christ, who is said to be the exact image and representation of the Father, when put in the situations, the sort of situations we find ourselves in, does not respond in the way that we would think a God would respond. He responds exactly the way that you or I would respond, which is by feeling forsaken by God, right? So that concept of doubt, those atheistic suspicions, are a part of the divine nature. And so when we are embodying the divine nature, that should be a part of what we are embodying. And when we deny that part of ourselves, and we think, even when we think shadow, because we think in terms of good and evil, we think that means it's something evil. And so like Peter Pan, we lose the shadow, right? But the shadow, as you said, that's the coincidentium oppositorum. Those are those two energies that are meant, these two forces that come together and give birth to novelty, right? They give birth to something that could not exist were there not these two opposing forces. And so I think the fact that the church has not learned to integrate its shadow is why we have the modern atheistic movement. And it's one of the reasons why it helped me out so much in the early stages of my own deconstruction. I learned so much from it. I now kind of find it a slightly boring conversation partner, and that's only because I don't think it's really updated itself in a few years, mainly because Christianity hasn't updated itself, so it doesn't really have anything to do to criticize. But I think it's a beautiful ally if we would only embrace it. There's a great book, Battling the Gods by Tim Whitmarsh, and he talks about the fact that the Athenian theaters were places where, atheistic dramas would be performed. And he asks the question, like, where in the hell in modern Christianity are there any sacred spaces where the ideas of a Lawrence Krauss or a Christopher Hitchens or a Richard Dawkins or a Sam Harris are actually taken seriously and discussed? They don't exist, right? Because we've neglected that. We've cut off our shadow. And so anyways, when we do finally experience and encounter that shadow, it's an absolute existential crisis, and it's hell
Mhm.
because we don't just have it as part of what it is to be a Christian, right? If you follow the path of the mystics, right? Any of the mystics, any of the Christian mystics, the Catholic mystics specifically, but Sufi mystics, really any mystics, there's always that idea of the dark night of the soul, which is the loss of God. It's a
Right.
part of the spiritual experience,
Right.
not the antithesis of the spiritual experience. And so I think, Heather, what you've provided us with in the book that you've provided us with, there's an opportunity here for those two things to come together. Because, okay, so here's my thought. I was an atheist for a season, and I often say this, that I tried to be an atheist, but I wasn't a good enough Christian to pull it off. And then I also say I tried to be a Christian, but I wasn't a good enough atheist to pull it off. Those two things have to come together in some ways. And so I think the modern atheist is still a lot more of a Christian than they realize they are. In fact, I know absolutely that I was. And there's the quote attributed to the Delphic Oracle. I believe it's in the preface to Jung's Red Book as well, that bidden or not, God will be present. So whether you invoke God or not, it doesn't matter. That God concept will still be present in some way, shape, or form in your life, even if it's just in the form of the language that's embedded in your soul because you've been raised in it. It's baked into you. So you can try to force yourself to speak a different language. You can try to force yourself to think in different terms, but it doesn't necessarily work, right? It doesn't necessarily work. And so a work like what you've provided us with so beautifully hits this target, because it is a departure from the naive understanding of this Edenic perfection and a return to a more complex second naivete version of the same thing, right? And Paul Ricoeur, anyone who's familiar with the work of Paul Ricoeur, gave us the term second naivete. He said that a symbol or that an idol must die so that a symbol of being may begin to speak, that the former way of understanding things has to die so it can give way to a symbolic way of understanding the thing that died. What all of these authors and religions and spiritual individuals and mystics were trying to tell us over the millennia, right? We literalized it, and therefore we lost the plot. But once we really lose the plot, we can rediscover what the plot really was. And so what you've given us in this book, building on the work of many before you, but said in a beautiful, artistic, and unique way, I think there's a real opportunity here for that to be rediscovered, because I think it's desperately needed within the quote unquote deconstruction movement right now, as though something with that adjective attached to it could be a movement. But I think it could prove to be an invaluable resource right now, because I see so many wonderful, amazing people who are just pitching, all things sacred. And I just think that's such a mistake, right?
Yeah.
Nietzsche's madman in The Gay Science did not gleefully and giddily proclaim God is dead and we have killed him. He wasn't chortling like some demonic troll and rubbing his hands together gleefully when he said God is dead and we have killed him. He came at daytime with a lantern, knowing that God was dead, philosophically speaking, in the modern world, and he was expecting it to be pitch black, which is why he brought a lantern. And he was like, oh, I've come too soon. You have not yet experienced the results of what you've done. He then says, thunder and lightning take time, so trust me, you will eventually, right? And so I think a lot of people who are just pitching all spirituality and just writing it off as superstition, fairy tales, mythology, don't actually understand the depth of what myth actually is.
Correct.
This is truth that is more true than literal truth.
Yeah.
This is the one story. This is the one single story that's being told over and over again, that we have been cyclically living out from the beginning of time, that is embedded in all of these myths. But when we literalize them, we lose it. But when we come to that point of second naivete and reinterpretation from a more critical standpoint, we can rediscover the deepest truths of our being. Yes, my deconstructed friends, even in the Bible. In fact, I think the Bible is one of the richest, deepest spiritual metaphysical texts that I've ever read. And I've read a lot, and maybe that's just because that's my native tongue, but I find more in that on the other side of deconstruction than I find in so much else. Anyways, Heather, I want to give you the last few minutes here, because we probably only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, but just leave us with whatever thoughts you want to leave us with.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation, and I love what you just invoked about Nietzsche because, yeah, I've sensed the same thing too, where um, it's not. I grow suspect when dismissal of God or there's any kind of like gleefulness in
Mhm.
trying to tear down these old beliefs because it's really the goal here is to like lead people on a path to growth and development and expansion and all of this. And so to to have been in that place and then turn around and try to attack or tear down or whatever is really like a suicidal impulse, you know?
Mm,
It's the equivalent of like shaming a 5-year-old for not being 21 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
wow,
Um
that's good.
and so yeah, it's I think that our challenge now is like you said, how do we uh, how do we invite people who do feel so wounded, so traumatized legitimately by their religion that they grew up with to understand some of this at least as the natural path of human progression
Mm.
and let it be a redemptive story.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think resources like the one you provided us with and written are a great step in that direction, Heather. So,
I hope so.
yeah, I know so. If
Yeah.
there had been a book like that available 10 years ago, it probably could have saved me a lot of hell. Uh, I honestly make it my aim. Anything I write, anything I say, anything I speak to, I write, speak, and say for exactly that purpose to
Yeah.
save the versions of me that exist out there in the form of other people right now, the hell that I had to endure. And then again, maybe you have to endure hell in order to truly be quote unquote born again. I don't know. But if there can be some comforts along the way, um, I aim to provide people with those. And I know that you've done that with this book. So, um, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I believe there's going to be some links in the show notes where you can get Heather's book on Amazon. Please pick it up. Not only are you supporting her and the work that she's doing and helping her to continue to write and do what she's doing, but you're also benefiting yourself. Okay, so grab a copy for yourself. If you're an Audible person, if you prefer an Audible book, the Audible version of it is fantastic as well, read by Heather herself. And I always prefer when an Audible book is read by the author, just because,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not the same when it's read by somebody else. So
Yeah.
that's
7
it.
hours of my voice.
Yeah, and I was gonna say
Just for you.
what a feat that was to read that as well when I saw how long it actually was. So
Yeah.
kudos to you for getting that done. Anyways, Heather, thank you so much for being on. It's been a pleasure to have you. I'd love to have you back sometime. It's a shame we only had an hour because I'd love to dive into a lot more,
I
and
know. It flew by.
it
So
did. It did.
thanks to both of you.
Yeah, so maybe we can do it again one of these Friday evenings or in another forum, okay? But thank you
Yep.
so much. And Aaron, thank you for being here with us as well. Thanks for being here the former hour.
Yep.
It's been a
You
great conversation, guys. Yeah. So again,
Thanks for
everybody,
having
thanks
me.
for tuning in. Check out Heather's book. Check out her website. Check out Aaron's YouTube site. All the social media links that are going to be posted in the show notes. And hey, have a great night. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Peace.